This chart shows history of African Americans in the United States, beginning with 1619, which was when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. In 1776, the U.S. became independent from England. So in this period between 1619 and 1776, the United States did not exist. It was a group of colonies under England. Tom Sawyer and Tom Whitewashes the Fence takes place in 1845. And 1865 is the end of the Civil War. In the 1860s, the northern states and the southern states fought each other in a civil war. Slavery was one of the issues. The North wanted to stop slavery, and the South wanted to keep on having slaves. There were other issues for that war as well. But at the end of the Civil War in 1865, slavery ended, and African Americans were no longer slaves in the United States. So the period of slavery goes from 1619, when the first African slaves came to this country, and ended in 1865. However, slavery ended in 1865, but there were still laws in many states, especially southern states, that kept white and black people separate and kept black people down. The schools were separate, housing was separate, everything had to be separate. And this period began at the end of the Civil War and continued until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And we call this the Jim Crow period. It was 100 years from the end of the Civil War to the 1960s Civil Rights Movement, when black people were not slaves in the United States, but they were not exactly free either, because many laws kept them poor and in the end down. And then the timeline ends now. So to go over this again, the period of slavery began in 1619, continued to 1865. The Jim Crow period began 1865 and continued to the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was led by people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy, and that was the time when laws began to be more equal and more fair, and gradually things got better and changed. In the Jim Crow period, here are some examples of some of the laws in different states. Intermarriage. In Mississippi and in many other states, the law was that people of white or mixed race and black people was not allowed. People could not marry between the races. And the definition was 1/8 or more of Negro blood. That means one great-grandparent made you black. In many states, including Missouri, there were separate schools for black children and white children. They could not attend the same schools. Restaurants were separate. Either it was a black restaurant or a white restaurant, and they could not go to the same restaurants. In buses, through most of the South, the waiting rooms were separate, and ticket windows were separate. Also on city buses, black people had to sit at the back of the bus and couldn't sit in the front. And even burial, when people died, they were not buried in the same place. The cemetery or burying ground for colored persons or black people was different from the ground used for white people. Okay, here's a slideshow, and I'll go through this and read aloud. African American history. African Americans were not immigrants to the United States. White people stole them from Africa and brought them to America as slaves. In this old drawing, Africans are being taken to a ship to go to America. Old painting of African prisoners in a slave ship. The first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. A woman for sale in a slave market. Newspaper ad for 4 slaves who ran away. Slave women working on a farm. A very early photograph of slaves in the 1800s. Slave women and children working in a tobacco barn. Slaves on a farm just before the Civil War. African American soldiers in the Northern Army during the Civil War. Newly freed slaves just after the Civil War. Children in Alabama in the 1890s. This is the time when Of the Coming of John takes place. Professor and graduates at an African American teachers' college in the 1890s. In the story, John attends a college like this. Slavery ended with the Civil War in 1865. However, laws in many places still kept African Americans down. This was called the Jim Crow era. It lasted for about 100 years. Jim Crow laws in many states, especially in the South, kept black and white people separate. For example, black people sat upstairs and in the back in a movie theater. Black people who broke the Jim Crow laws were punished by lynching. Lynching means that white people could kill them outside the law, but the white people who did this went free. The next 2 pictures are of lynchings. In the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement worked to end Jim Crow. In 1957, African American students tried to enter the new white school, the white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Soldiers guarded the school and did not let them go in. In 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested because she did not give her seat on the bus to a white man. Black people refused to ride the buses. The bus companies lost money, so they had to change their rules. After that, there were many demonstrations. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy became leaders of the movement. This kind of demonstration was called a sit-in. These young men waited to be served in a white restaurant until the police came to arrest them. In 1963, 250,000 people marched on Washington to demand equal rights. Slowly, things have changed since that time. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first American president of the United States. The first African American president of the United States. However, we have not solved all the problems yet. African Americans are still the poorest group in the United States. This shows the number of people by group, not really by race, who live in poverty. So this is 25.8% of black people are below the poverty line. Of non-citizens, of immigrants, it's 25.1%, a little bit lower than for black people. For Hispanic, that means for Spanish-speaking people, it's about the same level, but still lower than black people. For Asians and white people, it is similar and much lower. The poverty rate is much lower for Asians and whites.